Let me begin my presentation on culture and technology with two observations. The first one is this. The main entrance of a shopping mall not far from my home in Helsinki is equipped with an automatic revolving door. I've come to appreciate two of its features: the velocity of its circular motion, because the door revolves at a rate that allows me to enter and exit the shopping mall without a thought or change to my walking speed. I also appreciate the intelligence designed into the door because it automatically stops revolving whenever somebody accidentally touches it with any part of his or her body. Whenever this happens to me, it often triggers a feeling of panic and irritation in me. In contrast, my appreciation of the features of the non-automated doors of the main entrance to the Porteña building at the University of Helsinki takes a slightly different form. I am always conscious of my movement through these doors because I have to coordinate my action with the action of other people moving through the portals. The resulting experience with velocity in this event often makes me feel as if I'm getting sucked in or thrown out of the building, and this feeling often triggers momentary panic and irritation. Now, the second observation. I usually eat dinner with my family between 6 and 7 o'clock in the evening. Most of the people I know in Finland have their dinner at around 5:30. When I moved temporarily to Spain, this practice had an unexpected effect on my family's social life in terms of inviting friends to have dinner with us, because dinner time in Spain generally begins at 10 o'clock in the evening, and this is the time my family goes to sleep. And between 5 and 7 o'clock in the evening, most of the residents of Granada, where we lived, are having coffee and pastries while our stomachs were already growling for a more substantial meal. Okay, these stories serve two purposes. The first illustrates daily human interaction with a mundane piece of technology, the door, albeit a revolving door. The second leads to a question. Why does the timing of eating meals vary from one culture to another, given the universal human need to eat? These apparently unrelated themes permeate much of my presentation about culture and technology. I submit that culture and technology are co-determined phenomena. They are intertwined to the extent that separating them would mean unraveling the very fiber of contemporary daily life. Before I go into more detail about the cultural dimensions of technology, let me clarify some key terms that I often use in this presentation. I use the term human-technology interaction broadly to encompass people's usage of technology, although I specifically address some issues within the context of information and communication technology. This definition, therefore, subsumes human use of knowledge, which constitutes technologies, in addition to various tangible objects which can function automatically or somewhat semi-automatically, as in the case of machines. Hence, what we call human-technology interaction involves physical and cognitive motion. And by interaction, I simply mean the action-reaction between two or more self-contained unities. More precisely, I mean the observable motions between a human and a technology, without presuppositions as to whether the given technology constitutes intelligence, as it is often articulated in discourses regarding computerized technologies. Now, Let me sidetrack the moment about the issues of intelligence. What I mean here is more about the concept of intelligence as it's often used in artificial intelligence. And there's a very good book that you can consult that complete that gives a more complete discussion on this point. And this is a book by Lucy A. Suchman, and you will find the name of this book at the reference at the end of this lecture. So back to the issue at hand. Hence, even a mundane action such as that of slicing a tomato with a knife can be described in terms of human-technology interaction. That is, the motion of the muscles sets forth another physical motion or a reaction of the knife moving through the structure of the tomato. In this respect, it also follows that using the knowledge of how to use the knife is a cognitive phenomenon. Now I want to say something about human technology and the term human technology interaction and human factors. The term human technology interaction, as I use it, is compatible with the term human factors to the extent that both refer to the scientific discipline of designing for human use. Both concepts are concerned with a body of information about human abilities, human limitations, and other human characteristics that are relevant to design. However, I use the term human-technology interaction exclusively to distinguish the biased point of view of systems and systems design that I advocate, relative to the traditional point of view constituted in systems engineering. I place humans and human factors as the starting point for systems design. Now a word about the term system. By the term system, I mean an interacting combination at any level of complexity of people, materials, tools, machines, software, facilities, and procedures designed to work together to some common purpose. I give primacy to the human-centric view of systems and systems design, while acknowledging this view must be integrated with the architectural and functional view in order to fully describe the requirements for a given system, and eventually producing it embodied in an artifact used by people. Now, I've been using this word artifact now for some time now in this presentation, so let me open this up a little bit more also. I broadly use this term artifact to subsume material and immaterial objects and subjects pertaining to human interaction with technology. You know, when I first started doing my research on culture and technology, and through my conversations with friends, and generally with people who are not involved in issues being studied by cognitive scientists, I realized quite early that, from the common sense perspective, culture and technology might appear unrelated. Culture is something quite abstract. Although if we read a newspaper or a website of a newspaper, we expect to get information on the arts, performances, entertainment, and other cultural events. Should it come into consciousness in daily life, the notion of culture is probably connected to conversations about the arts, or rituals linked to certain traditions, or national identity, ethnicity, and many other equally abstract notions. On the other hand, technology, particularly electronics technology, has become prevalent in the daily life of millions of people virtually in all parts of the world. It would be fair to say that most people today would associate the word technology with so-called high-tech fields like genetics, biotechnology, computer technology, aerospace technology, to name just a few. To some, the things I have expressed thus far are simply too obvious to be bothered with. I maintain, however, that the so-called obvious, at least for the field of technology design, is one of the main sources of mistakes both in design thinking and in the resulting human-technology interactions. We therefore should take the time to ask the following questions. What is culture? What is technology? At this point, I offer a simplified answer to the first question, what is culture? As follows. Culture is a way of life. Now, this definition emphasizes the knowledge, practice, and artifacts that constitute what we call culture. In contrast, the concept race or ethnicity, although often used interchangeably with culture, is not subsumed in this definition, my definition does. Race is about people, is specifically a concept for categorizing people according to distinct physical characteristics. Culture is about a way or a form of life. As an example, a Chinese or an African infant raised by Finnish parents grows up speaking perfect Finnish, inclusive of regional dialect. The child grows to like eating meatballs and potatoes with a fork and knife, and to like going to a hot sauna at least once a week. Similarly, Finnish children who move with or without their parents to a different culture acquire the cultural repertoire, the way of life of the people among whom they live. An important distinction that I want to point out now is the concept of co-culture, especially as it is applied to a group of people with motor and sensory disability. I submit that if we accept the definition of culture as a way or form of life, then we had to acknowledge that a group consisting of people with reduced sensory and motor capacity has a distinctive form of life. They might share cultural elements with one or more groups, for example, within a given national boundary, but they also possess certain knowledge and adaptive practices that are completely different from the other groups. I agree with the definition that was given by a Spanish philosopher by the name of Jose Ortega y Gasset. And this is how he defined technology. And I quote, technology is man's reaction to nature or circumstance. It leads to the construction of a new nature, a supernature interposed between man and original nature. So what we call nature is a product of interaction between humans and environments in which they are situated. This implies that technology is a reaction to the necessities of life. However, one can see that this is not necessarily true when one considers that let's say, the nearly daily encounters in contemporary life with cultural artifacts such as books, television, movies, digital games, etc. And Ortega y Gasset also had insight on this particular issue, and is very, very interesting. But technology is not restricted to the satisfaction of necessities. As old as the invention of tools and procedures for keeping warm, feeding, and so on, are many others serving to procure obviously unnecessary objects and situations. As old and as widespread as the act of lighting a fire, for instance, is that of getting drunk. I mean to say the use of substances and procedures which produce a psychophysical state of pleasurable exaltation or delightful stupor. The drug is as primitive an invention as any. So much so, in fact, that it is even open to discussion whether fire was invented primarily for the purpose of avoiding the cold, an organic necessity, and a sine qua non of life, or of getting drunk. We know of primitive tribes who light a fire in a cave which makes them sweat so profusely that from the combined smoke and excessive heat they fall into a swoon akin to drunkenness. These are the so-called sweat houses. So there are 2 points I want to emphasize here. First, the inherent ambiguity in the relationship between the form and function of what Ortega and Y Gasset calls the constructed new nature, that is, new artifact that interpose between humans and nature. The second is that the new artifact, that is, technology, has both tangible and intangible form. The technology of lighting a fire consists of tangible objects as well as knowledge of at least the procedures involved. Acknowledging this ambiguity helps to understand the possibilities for variations in the meaning of technology, meaning that gets passed on from generation to the next. Many mundane objects and situated actions in daily life, from cooking a meal to driving an automobile, can take on universal as well as varied form and meaning. In contemporary daily life, new technologies such as the miniature digital music gadgets and mobile telephones are subject to this phenomenon. One can argue that culture is made more familiar through its embodiment in the arts and rituals, but this view does not make it any more obvious how culture and technology are linked. A realization of the interconnection between the two might come about as a byproduct of international travel. And often in such a case, it is a realization of a paradox. It would be reasonable to say that culture is indeed about the arts, rituals, and traditions of a given society. However, technology could not possibly have any connection with culture. I submit that the connection could be made more obvious by examining many mundane artifacts of our daily life, like food, music, and time. Humans are the only known animal species that cooks its food. What people eat, when and how they are eaten, are components of every culture. A typical Andalusian would not think of eating anything more than some bread brushed with olive oil, perhaps topped with some fresh tomatoes, and to drink coffee with it for breakfast. Whereas a typical Southern Finn will include porridge, bread spread with butter, probably topped with some cucumber or ham. The content and timing of the other meals similarly differ. Imagine what would happen to the food cultures of Spain and Finland if one takes away the technology of cooking with heat. Then imagine the repercussions to all the other human cultures. In the former case, both Andalusians and Southern Finns certainly would have to take away beer from their diets if the technology of producing heat to boil liquids and food materials was never developed. Of the music we listen to in contemporary life, popular music is an exemplary of the link between culture and technology. Many musicians, and the music industry in general, are reliant on electronics technology, including the computer. All the contemporary composers could compose Baroque-style music in their computers. The culture-technology connection might not be so obvious to a Baroque music aficionado. Going back a few centuries, however, composers and musicians were similarly dependent on technology. In fact, today, we would not have the chance to listen to the Violin Partita No. 1 in B minor, played either by a violinist or a guitarist, If Johann Sebastian Bach did not have access to the violin, an instrument with an ancient history and whose construction depends on technology, wood processing and acoustics, to name the most obvious technologies. With regards to the idea of culture as rituals and traditions, for example, rituals and traditions supporting our concept of time, imagine what would happen to our rituals of making appointments for lunch, to meet a friend to see a film, or to meet a client to discuss business, if we did not have the technologies embedded in timepieces like clocks and wristwatches. Similarly, imagine the types of adjustments one would have to make to the whole English culture and the history of building the English Empire. If chronometers were never developed in the 18th century for maritime navigation, in conjunction with establishing Greenwich as the starting point for measuring accurate time. And similarly, one cannot deny the significance of European shipbuilding, navigation, and their underlying technologies. The point I'm trying to get at is that culture and technology are inseparable, not even in principle. There is no technology-free human culture. Separating the two necessitates undoing human cultures. Certainly, contemporary cultures in all parts of the world would not be the same if electricity, automobiles, telephones, airplanes, nuclear energy, television, and computers did not exist. One could safely argue that if all the computers in our world vanished suddenly, contemporary civilization would fall into a chaotic state. I want at this point to differentiate the view of culture and technology that I am advocating from the notion of technological determinism. That is, the idea that technology is a predominant determinant of social life and that technology develops autonomously. Although I agree with Jose Ortega y Gasset's argument that human beings are essentially technological and that history is transformed by changes in technology, I am proposing a view which asserts that the relationship between culture and technology is one of co-determination or co-specification. While changes in technology do indeed cause changes in the practices and ideas of a culture, changes in a culture's characteristic could similarly trigger changes in technology. Once we acknowledge the co-determination of culture and technology, we could also begin to see how technology artifacts used in our daily life might trigger variations in social cultural conventions. Consider the telephone. It is plausible that the majority of people today use it as a form of voice communication, in contrast to using it for communication involving text or video. Language differences in the ritual of greeting another person at the beginning of a telephone call could give us some clues. One might notice, for example, that in Spain, people answer the telephone by saying "dígame," which is which could be translated in English as "tell me," while in Finland, people answer by saying their surname, and in the United States, people say "hello." A telephone and its supporting electronics technologies are more or less standardized. Hence, one would expect that people would use it in the same way. Yet it appears that social-cultural conventions could determine the way people use it. Within culture, variations could also occur. When I visited Beijing the first time in the year 2000, I saw people on crowded streets using their mobile phones as if it was what you call a walkie-talkie. That is, they hold the telephone away from their ears and closer to their mouths, when they are speaking and vice versa. In the same time frame, the same year, I noticed that people in Tokyo and in Beijing attach various decorative objects to their telephones, while in daily life experience as pedestrian in Finland, one observes that drivers do not. In fact, it seems that, as a rule of thumb, drivers attempt to drive across the designated crosswalk zone before a pedestrian who is in the driver's full view can put one of his or her feet from the sidewalk to the pavement of the street. Closer to our homes, consider the door that we use for entering our houses and apartments. Doors and their functions are things that one usually considers as obvious. We enter and exit our houses, apartments, as well as various types of buildings without much thought about them. But let us consider the following. In some countries, for example, Finland and Sweden, the majority of homes' exterior doors open outward, while in other countries, for example, in Spain, the United Kingdom, United States, these types of doors swing inward. From the perspective of human-technology interaction, the architecture of thresholds, that is doors, gates, portals, and passageways, in connection with the architecture of structures and the traditional function of a private home as a space for residence, rest, and interaction, presents an exemplary artifact that we can study to help shed light on the issues we are now considering. The Encyclopedia Britannica provides a definition of a door as a barrier of wood, stone, metal, glass, paper, leaves, hides, or combination of materials, installed to swing, fold, slide, or roll in order to close an opening to a room or building. I submit the idea that our daily action of entering and exiting various types of spaces, such as bedrooms, bathrooms, and boardrooms, is a microcosm of human technology interaction with an interface. And that interface is called the door. This view could help us conceptualize how a mundane object, such as a door, is actually a technology with a long history of development throughout the parallel evolution of human cultures. We began with a working definition specifying a door as a barrier. However, I propose a switch in the specification to one more akin to dynamic, semi-permeable boundary between portions of spaces, the physical and metaphysical. This switch in metaphor is useful because it provides plasticity to the concepts that we use in the effort to arrive at plausible answers as to why it is difficult to conceptually connect culture and technology, as well as to other questions. The other two examples of ubiquitous technologies provided earlier, the telephone and automobile, undoubtedly provided technological change contributing to human evolution and development of cultures, worldwide diffusion, and ubiquity. They also share another characteristic with the door conceptualized as an interface. These artifacts have served to extend and change human perceptions of the environment, specifically of spatial and time relationship. These technologies have extended human mobility in increased magnitude. In speaking of extending human mobility, it is also fitting to speak in this context of contracting spatial and temporal perceptions. The reach of human locomotion and communication has been concurrently extended spatially and abbreviated temporally. The telephone and the automobile have gained the status of interfaces to the spatio-temporal dimension, as well as an interface to our interaction with each other. The door has a similar status. Whereas we spoke of extensions and contractions in the context of telephones and automobiles, the form and function of the door compels us to speak of separateness and unity. Viewing the threshold on the physical level, architectural theorist Laurent Stadler said, "The threshold separates the public and the private sphere, private and common property, and self-determined and over-directed action. As an architectural element of spatial configuration, it highlights historical specific, culturally determined zone of transitions in which certain gestures and activities are performed." Stadler speaks of the door's historical function as a barrier rather than as an interface as I am suggesting. But Stadler also characterizes the door as a point of transition, a view that is more compatible with the notion of circular transitional movements between separatedness and unity. We can view these movements as a relationship of mutual determination. The historical account of the door shows that this mutual determination has been embodied within cultures and the artifact of the door itself, and passed on from generation to generation, all the way to contemporary daily life. The cultural meaning of the door has dissolved into the background to the point that we would have difficulty in articulating its connection to our cultures, literally or metaphorically. While the history of threshold technology goes back to ancient times, and thus has had ample time to recede into the realm of tacit knowledge, I maintain that the cultural meanings of postmodern artifacts, such as computers and their software programs, have already reached a similar tacit status, especially among the generation who have been born after the advent and diffusion of the digital computer and related technologies. It is interesting to note also that another architectural component, a window, has become a trademark as well as a metaphor for the interface between material and immaterial spaces. In light of the preceding examples, we are confronted with the issue of different usage in different cultural contexts of technologies that has become diffused, prevalent in daily life, and more or less standardized. There are logical reasons for the differences, and many of these reasons are linked to cultural characteristics. As one can see from a non-expert's perspective, it is not so obvious how technology and culture are linked, nor how they figure in daily life. When one makes a switch of perspectives from a non-expert to expert, the situation does not seem to improve much. I gave you earlier a simplified definition of culture. I want to open it more and relate it to the question, why do contemporary designers and developers of technology find it difficult to keep culture in mind? A contributing factor to the difficulty is an issue with definition of terms. The notion of culture is a slippery one. In fact, there is no generally accepted definition. My own definition of culture is due to the cultural materialist perspective. Simply stated, culture is a way of life shared by a social group. It constitutes thoughts and actions that have been developed in order to cope with natural constraints on human actions. From the perspective of applying scientific knowledge to daily life, examining the notions of culture and technology as separate and combined subjects challenges us to formulate plausible answers to three more questions. What is the significance of culture to daily human experience? Why is technology important to human culture? Why do we need to understand the interaction of these artifacts? Let's briefly examine these questions. Some time ago, anthropologist Edward T. Hall observed that most of our difficulties with the notion of culture stem from our own ignorance. He said, "We continue to fail to grasp the true significance of the fact that culture controls behavior in deep and persisting ways, any of which are outside our awareness and therefore beyond conscious control of the individual." Hall was speaking within the context of the United States, where he found that an anthropologist is often ignored when he or she stresses the previous point about culture. I believe this observation applies within all contemporary human cultures. Hall also said, "Culture hides more than it reveals, and strangely enough, what it hides most effectively from its own participant." I also believe that whoever takes on the enterprise of studying human cultures eventually encounters this paradox. We are all enculturated in one or more sociocultural systems, and much of the process happens more or less in an unconscious manner.